There are places you can pass 100 times and never notice. Hidden doors in the world, not locked, not marked, just forgotten. Until someone like Jack comes along. Jack wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, he was on vacation, a self-guided hiking trip in Eastern Europe, away from city noise, away from work stress, away from, well, people in general. The village he had stayed in the night before was barely more than 10 houses and a roadside bar. The old man behind the counter had pointed him toward a trail, saying, "It's safe, as long as you stay on the path." Then, with a little smirk, he had added, "If you wander, sometimes you find things better left alone." Jack had laughed it off at the time. But now, in the pale light of early afternoon, the marked trail felt too tame. He saw it by accident, a narrow deer path branching away into the trees, almost swallowed by ferns. The air there felt different. Still. Expectant. And Jack, being Jack, decided he'd see where it went. The path dipped into a hollow, and that's when he saw it. Half hidden under moss and fallen branches was a square of rusted steel. Not a shed. Not a trapdoor for firewood. A bunker entrance. A heavy, military-style hatch, tilted on old hinges, its locking wheel mottled with orange corrosion. Beside it, jutting from the ground like the bones of a dead animal, was a concrete air vent, its metal grate bent inward, as if something had tried to get out. Jack stood there for a long moment, listening. Nothing. No wind here. No birdsong. Just that strange, thick silence. He knelt, brushed away leaves from the hatch, and gripped the wheel. It didn't move at first. He shifted his weight, using both hands, and with a teeth-gritting squeal, it gave. The smell hit him immediately, damp concrete, rust, and something faintly sour, like old milk. The hatch groaned open. Below was a narrow set of metal stairs descending into darkness. The air coming out was cold enough to prickle his skin. Jack glanced back toward the trail, just a speck of daylight through the trees now. He told himself he'd just look around. A quick peek. Maybe there'd be some old equipment, something worth photographing. The first few steps groaned under his weight. His phone's flashlight beam cut across gray concrete walls streaked with moisture. A faded stencil on the wall read, in chipped Cyrillic letters. Military installation. Jack's heart gave a little thrill. This wasn't just an old cellar, this had been something important. At the bottom of the stairs, a corridor stretched away into shadow, lined with peeling paint and warped doors. The first room he peeked into was empty, except for a table with one chair, toppled over. The ceiling dripped steadily into a puddle on the floor. The second room had beds. 3 of them, metal frames, the mattresses rotted and split open, their stuffing spilling out like pale weeds. Above each bed, a nameplate, all scratched out. He shivered, moving on. The corridor bent sharply, revealing a set of double blast doors, each with a viewing slit. They were open just enough for him to slip through. Beyond was a larger chamber. Rows of metal lockers stood in uneven lines, some open, some shut tight. Jack tried one. Inside were uniforms, stiff with mold, the patches too faded to read. Another locker had nothing but a pair of boots, soles chewed by mice. As he swung the beam across the floor, something glittered. He bent down, a broken wristwatch, its face cracked, hands frozen at 2:17. He turned to leave the chamber, and froze. Somewhere, deep in the bunker, something scraped. It wasn't loud, just the slow drag of something against concrete. Then, silence again. Jack's rational brain whispered, probably a rat. Just a rat. But a smaller, older part of his brain, the part that remembered the feeling of being hunted, told him to leave. Still, he didn't. Instead, he found another passage branching away, this one with heavy electrical cables sagging from the ceiling. He followed it into a control room, or what had once been one. Banks of switches and dials sat dead and dusty. A single chair was bolted to the floor in front of a cracked console. On the wall was a large, peeling map of the surrounding area. Red circles marked certain locations, one of them the very village Jack had stayed in. His light swept over the desk. There was a folder, its papers warped and stuck together, but one page slid free, a typed report in Russian. He couldn't read it, but a date near the top was clear, April 12, 1986. The scraping sound came again. Closer this time. Jack's heart thudded. He slowly turned off his flashlight. The darkness was absolute. From somewhere down the hall, something breathed. He flicked the light back on, the beam trembling slightly. The hall was empty. He backed toward the blast doors, moving faster now. When he stepped through, he noticed something he hadn't before. The doors weren't just open, they were bent outward, as if forced from the inside. Jack climbed back to the stairwell. The cold air was thicker now, almost damp on his skin. He reached for the ladder and froze. The hatch above was shut. He was sure he'd left it open. He told himself it was just gravity, or a gust of wind, or his own nerves playing tricks. With an effort, he spun the wheel, shoving the hatch open. Pale daylight spilled in. Relieved, he stepped out into the clearing. And stopped. The forest was different. The light was lower, more golden, as if hours had passed. The air was utterly still. No wind. No birds. He looked back at the hatch, and saw that the concrete vent now had something new. A dark smear, almost like soot, except for the faint, unmistakable fingerprints pressed into it. Part 1 ends here. Part 2 will take Jack deeper back into the bunker after he realizes he can't just walk away, and the horror will begin to close in. Do you want me to drop Part 2 right away so you can keep the momentum going? It'll pick up with Jack trying to leave, but the forest itself won't quite let him, leading him back underground. Jack backed away from the hatch, one hand still holding the edge. The smear on the vent, it was fresh. Moist. The prints were wrong, too. Too long, like the fingers had extra joints. He swallowed hard and forced himself to turn toward the trail. It wasn't there. There were trees, sure, tall, black-barked pines stretching into the distance, but no sign of the worn path he had taken here. Everywhere he looked was the same repeating wall of trunks. Jack took a step forward. Then another. After maybe 20 meters, he looked back. The hatch was closer. Panic prickled up his neck. He spun, walking faster, then breaking into a jog. The trees seemed to lean inward, the light filtering through them dimming as if clouds had swallowed the sun. A cold breath of wind curled around him, carrying the smell of wet metal. Something moved between the trees. Not an animal. Tall. Thin. Barely glimpsed, but moving with purpose. Jack didn't wait to see more. He ran. Branches clawed at his jacket. The forest floor seemed to tilt under his feet. He pushed harder, lungs burning, until he burst back into the clearing. The hatch sat there, gaping open like a mouth. Jack stood, gasping. The air here was easier to breathe. As if the forest beyond had been squeezing the oxygen from it. He looked once toward the trees. Something was standing there. Just inside the shadow line. Watching. He couldn't make out a face, or any features, really. Just a darker shape against the dark. Then it tilted its head. And stepped forward. Jack didn't think. He went back down the stairs, pulling the hatch closed over him. The sound of the wheel locking into place was almost a relief, until he realized he had just sealed himself inside. The air below was colder now. His light caught fresh trails in the dust on the floor. Not footprints exactly, more like smears, as if something heavy had been dragged along. He told himself he just needed to find another exit. Old bunkers had multiple points of egress. Right? He retraced his steps to the control room. On the far wall was a secondary door he hadn't noticed before, smaller, with a faded radiation warning on it. The hinges screamed as it opened. Beyond was a narrow tunnel. The walls here weren't painted, just raw concrete, damp and sweating. His footsteps echoed in a way they hadn't before, as if the tunnel were swallowing the sound a split second late. The first room he found was tiny, a storage closet, maybe. Shelves lined with rusted cans. Some labels still clung to them, but the language was foreign. One can had fallen and split open. Inside wasn't food at all, but a compact bundle of wires and what looked like teeth. Human teeth, wrapped together with copper wire. Jack's stomach turned. He moved on. The next door was locked, but the wall beside it had a jagged hole, maybe from water damage. Jack crouched and shone his light through. It was a dormitory, bigger than the first he'd seen. But the beds weren't empty. Figures lay under thin gray blankets, utterly still. For a terrible moment, he thought they were corpses. But then, one sat up. Jack yelped and stumbled back. His light jerked away from the hole, but in that flash he'd seen the face. Pale. Hairless. Eyes like wet glass. And its mouth had opened wider than it should have been able to. He turned and hurried down the tunnel, fighting the urge to break into a sprint. The air was changing again, heavier, tinged with something sharp and metallic. A curve in the tunnel brought him to another chamber, and here, finally, was something that looked like an exit, a rusted ladder climbing up toward a distant grate. Jack slung his backpack, gripped the ladder, and started up. The rungs wobbled under his weight but held. He climbed maybe halfway before his light caught movement above. The grate shifted. Two pale hands slid around the bars from the outside. The fingers curled inward, long, double-jointed, the nails cracked but sharp. Jack froze, one boot still braced on the rung. The hands tested the grate. Metal squealed. Then the thing lowered its head into view. Its eyes were black now. The skin around its mouth was split, as if it had been stretched too many times. Jack dropped. He hit the floor hard, breath whooshing out of him. He scrambled to his feet, backing toward another side tunnel, and that's when he heard it. The sound wasn't footsteps. It was more like the sound of wet rope being dragged. Coming closer. He ducked into the side passage. This one sloped downward at a sharp angle, the walls closing in until he had to crouch. His light caught streaks on the walls, dark, dried stains in shapes that suggested someone had clawed their way along. The passage ended in a small circular chamber. In the center was a hatch in the floor. It wasn't like the one above, this one was smaller, with a handle instead of a wheel. A faded stencil beside it read, Level -3. Jack hesitated. Going deeper felt like madness. But the dragging sound was still in the main tunnel, and it was closer now. He wrenched the hatch open and dropped through. Sound cue, metallic clang as hatch shuts above. The room he landed in was cramped, lined with shelves holding rows of jars. Inside each jar was something. Some held animal organs suspended in yellow fluid. Others held things that were almost human, hands, eyes, chunks of skin with tattoos still visible. One jar was cracked, its contents gone. The fluid had dried into a sticky amber crust. A single corridor led out. Jack followed it, heart hammering. It ended at a door painted completely black. There was a viewing slit at eye level. Jack lifted the flap and peered through. The beam of his light fell across a vast chamber, easily the size of a warehouse. And in the center was a pit. A perfect circle, maybe 20 meters across. No railing, no cover, just a sheer drop into darkness. Something was moving in the pit. At first he thought it was water, rippling, heaving. But then shapes began to emerge. Pale shapes. Climbing over each other. Hundreds of them. All hairless, all with those same stretched mouths and black eyes. They moved like a single living organism, pulling themselves upward toward the rim. Jack dropped the flap and stepped back. A sound rose from beyond the door, not a scream, not quite. More like a collective inhalation, as if the things in the pit had just smelled him. From somewhere behind him came a metallic clang, the sound of the hatch he had dropped through being opened. He ran. The corridor seemed longer now, twisting in ways it hadn't before. His light caught movement ahead, a door swinging open on its own. He didn't care where it led. He ducked inside and slammed it shut. The room was pitch black except for the beam of his flashlight. Something dripped steadily onto the floor. Jack raised his light. The ceiling above him was moving. The ceiling wasn't just moving, it was breathing. The surface bulged down in slow, steady pulses, each exhale releasing a faint, sour heat into the room. Jack's throat tightened. His mind screamed to get out, but his legs refused to move. Something began to push through. First, a hand, pale, with far too many knuckles, pressed against the ceiling as if the concrete was soft clay. Then another hand, gripping next to it, the fingers splayed unnaturally wide. The concrete split like rotten wood. A head forced its way through. It wasn't one of the pale things he'd glimpsed before. This one was worse, larger, with a skull too long in the back, its jaw unhinged so far he could see the pale tissue at the base of its throat. Its eyes weren't black. They were empty. Holes that swallowed the light. That broke his paralysis. Jack yanked the door open and bolted into the corridor. He didn't care where it led, he just needed to put walls between him and that thing. The tunnel twisted sharply, bringing him into a stairwell that descended into deeper dark. He had no choice, the sound of breaking concrete behind him told him the thing was through. He plunged downward, taking the steps two at a time. The air grew colder with each level, and the smell, that copper metallic tang, was so strong now it coated his tongue. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a huge chamber. This one had lights, not his, but faint red bulbs mounted high along the walls, still burning after God knew how many decades. They cast the entire space in a bloody haze. Rows of tall, cylindrical tanks stood in the chamber. Each one was filled with cloudy fluid, and in each one, something floated. Some looked human. Others didn't. One figure drifted close to the glass as Jack passed. Its eyes opened. A hiss filled the chamber. It came from the far end, where a set of massive steel doors were slowly sliding apart. Jack didn't wait to see what was on the other side, he darted between the tanks, looking for any sign of another exit. He found a service hatch low on the wall. It was barely big enough for him to crawl through, but it led into a maintenance shaft. The shaft was cramped, the metal floor slick with condensation. Somewhere above, faint thuds echoed, too rhythmic to be random. Jack crawled until the shaft ended at a grate. Beyond it, he could see another room, smaller, lined with shelves of binders and film canisters. He kicked the grate loose and slid out. On a desk in the center sat an open file. The cover sheet was in Russian, but several words had been underlined in red pencil. Jack recognized only two: project and containment. Beside the file was a single black and white photograph. It showed the bunker, this bunker, when it had been new. Soldiers stood in neat rows at the entrance, their faces stern. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows of the open hatch, was a figure. It wasn't human. Jack dropped the photo, his hands shaking. Somewhere nearby, metal screamed as if wrenched by incredible force. The red lights in the previous chamber flickered. He needed to move. A side door led him into another passage, this one sloping upward. His heart leapt. Maybe this was it. Maybe he was heading toward daylight. The incline grew steeper. The walls here were cleaner, less damaged, as if this section had been maintained longer. Then he saw it, a vertical shaft with a ladder leading up toward what looked like daylight streaming through a grating. Jack started to climb. Halfway up, a sound rose from below. Not the dragging, not the breathing. A voice. It spoke in Russian, the words slow, deliberate, and wrong. The tone was all wrong, like someone reading phonetically without understanding meaning. Then it repeated the same sentence in a higher pitch. Then lower. By the fourth repetition, Jack realized it wasn't a sentence at all. It was just mimicking. Something grabbed the ladder below him. The metal shook as weight slammed onto it. Jack scrambled upward, his hands slipping on the damp rungs. He was almost to the top when pale fingers wrapped around his boot. He kicked wildly. His heel connected with something soft. The grip loosened just enough for him to haul himself up the last few rungs. The grate at the top was rusted but not locked. He shoved it aside and pulled himself out. Into the forest. It was dusk now. The sky was a deep bruised purple, the tree leaned black against it. Jack staggered to his feet, breathing hard. He turned to find the hatch, but there was no hatch. Just grass and moss. No opening. No sign the shaft had ever existed. A sound drifted through the trees. Breathing. Slow. Steady. Coming from all directions at once. Jack turned in a slow circle. The forest seemed wrong again. Too symmetrical. Every tree the same height, the same distance apart. Then, between the trunks, he saw movement. Figures. Dozens of them. Standing motionless. Watching. He took one step backward, and his heel caught on something. He glanced down. It was a broken wristwatch. The same model he'd found in the bunker. Its hands were still frozen at 2:17. The figures began to move. Not toward him, but around him, circling. Their movements were jerky, as if each one was being pulled forward on strings. The circle tightened. Jack bolted toward what he thought was open forest. Branches whipped his face, roots snagged his boots. The sky above dimmed with every step until it was almost black. He burst into a clearing. In the center was a hatch. The same hatch. It was already open. From the darkness below came that voice again, mimicking his own panicked breaths. Then it spoke, in perfect English now. You came back. Jack's legs moved without his consent. He stepped forward, down into the opening. The hatch swung shut behind him with a clang that echoed far too long.